Boiten here. I'm a cybersecurity expert most of the time.
Mute your microphone.
Echo. I will be talking today about data, all different sorts of data, how they relate, and what the interesting political and legal dimensions of that might be. Can I click to the next one? Okay. Right. So big data is a big thing, open data is a big thing, and personal data is a big problem. So how do these things relate? Well, they're different things to start with, but the intersections are what makes it somewhat interesting. Right, so there are different things and there are intersections between them. The Open Data Institute in the UK has come up with a number of interesting definitions for all of these. So the big data, the sort of technological view of big data is data that doesn't fit on your computer by itself, or that doesn't fit on your hard drive by itself, data that you can't handle with conventional tools. That's the technological perspective that computer scientists take. So it's a problem. You need to process data in a different way, and you need to invent new technology for it, and that's fine for computer scientists. But what in practice big data means in the media and in most applications of it is something much less precise than that. It's not about the amount of data. It's not about the velocity and all these beautiful V's that apply to big data, but it's mostly about, okay, we've got data and we want to do something big with it, and we want to do something with it that nobody else had thought of before. Or even in a slightly more cynical context, a lot of organizations know that they produce a lot of data, but they don't actually know. They have a sense that they should be doing something with it, that there's deep hidden information about their customers, about their operations in there, and they need someone to extract it from them. Open data, on the other hand, the Open Data Institute are concerned with this topic in the first place, of course, so their definition is one that's thought through to some depth. It's information or data maybe that's available for anyone to use for any purpose at no cost. So if you have to pay for it, it's out. If you restrict the purpose, it's out. What's not excluded in this definition is that you might have to apply for a license to use it, as long as the license doesn't restrict what you can do with the data. Okay, and all of these are part of political agendas, which I'll come to in a minute. Whereas personal data is the thing that we're worried about today when we look at data protection. This is clearly not the definition of the GDPR or previous data protection legislation. It's a loose definition. It's data about people, where the important thing is that you can distinguish people in the group from it. So how about the intersections between those? Big data, big open data, that's all right. So there is data that you can put out there, and you can hope that somebody gets extract data, important things from it. And big data, personal data is getting a bit more interesting. Big data, personal data, it lives in lots of places. It lives with data brokers. It lives on the edges of social media. It lives in surveillance systems. So big personal data is probably the category of data that we would like as a society to regulate a bit and have some control over, but in practice, big personal data is to some extent being kept out of our sight, being kept out of proper regulation, because the Facebooks and the data brokers pass this data between each other, and we don't really know everything that's going on there. Open personal data is a political question. Is there such a thing as data about everybody that you can make available for anyone to use at any purpose for no cost? Particularly the any purpose makes this problematic. is if you make data available to everybody, is it fair processing in the terms of data protection legislation that you put no restrictions on what the data is processed for? Probably not. I will come to that later. There are categories of people who say that according to this definition of open data, you can't really have open personal data. I will not talk about security concerns. Now, an interesting category of data that seems to exist almost in contradiction to personal data is something that people sometimes call public data. Right, so personal data, we know data protection applies to. Public data is potentially a free-for-all. And then my definition of public data would be something loose along the lines of, well, public data is data you can find for free on the internet. It's the subject of social media research. We can look at everybody's public Facebook post or everybody's tweets on a particular topic and derive things from it, and it's a free for all. Right, so yes, public data in that sense is certainly big data. There's a tremendous amount of things that we can troll for, that we can scrape for. So it's definitely big data. Open data doesn't have to be made public. Open data can be sitting behind a license. That might mean that might imply that the organization providing the open data at least knows who has their data. And public data is a bit more wide than just open data, in the sense that for open data, if you want open data to be nicely structured data, to be data that's accessible for the public, and innovative developers to do innovative technological developments with, it better be somewhat structured. There be some structure to the information. For example, it's all GPS data, or it's all IP addresses, or whatever else, because the unstructured way in which information is available on the web, plain text in tweets. You need to do some extra analysis to extract what the information really is in the data. Right? The big problematic question, one that's often misunderstood, is how does personal data relate to public data? And if we're talking data protection, then the issue is very clear. Personal data and public data can overlap. There is public data about people available for free on the internet. Yeah, you can have interesting discussions about what the terms and conditions of Twitter mean exactly. The terms and conditions of Twitter tell you that a tweet is in the public domain, and you should have no expectations really about what people might do with them. And that seems to be raising no expectations in terms of data protection of that data. But it remains, if personal data is found on the internet in some random way, that remains protected by data protection legislation. A famous case in the UK where this one hit was the Samaritan's Radar case of a few years ago. This is where a helpful, well-intentioned charity decided to write a client a bot for Twitter. This would allow people to look at their Twitter feed and then to analyze all the tweets of all the people that they followed to see whether these people were actually having suicidal thoughts. There was some processing, some natural language processing going on to determine whether the tweets were suicidal or not. This is in itself a little bit problematic as far as I'm concerned. I'm disappointed with the lack of progress that so-called artificial intelligence has made in natural language understanding. But even if that was a very, very secure process, there was still a big problem with this, which is that the people installing this bot were the people who were not the people who were being monitored. So the people who would have their tweets followed by an automated tool which was deciding whether they were suicidal or not, and then potentially acting on the basis of that. That's a form of surveillance that nobody just posting things on Twitter was necessarily expecting, that could potentially be abused by outsiders wanting to be intrusive, and it also generated sensitive personal data in the sense of prospective mental health diagnosis about people without people being aware of it. And because of all that, the Data Protection Authority in the UK, the ICO, decided that it was better to stop this app, and it has been stopped now. But it was essentially a question of the naive explanation that allowed it was, well, this is all public data, so personal. We don't have to worry about data protection on this that much. The expectation is anything can happen to it. Well, not everything is fair. So having looked at a couple of categories of data, public, private, etc. The interesting thing for data narratives in general is to look at how things move from one category to the other. Right. So one transition that you can look at is data moving from being personal to being public. And this is what's called the death of privacy. Right, all these youngsters put all that stuff on Facebook, and by doing so, they're giving away all their privacy. Of course, from a more sophisticated perspective of privacy, for a perspective that privacy is not just about sharing confidential information, this story is too simplistic. Right. Yes, some young people share amazing things, astonishing things on public media, on social media. That's absolutely true. But on top of that, there's also all social media provide privacy controls. And it is my experience that actually all these people who do share things and who don't share things have quite good control of who they share what to. So they may be sharing private information, but it's not the death of privacy necessarily. A more sophisticated narrative on privacy would say privacy is not just about sharing information or not, but it's about taking control about what information you share with whom. And in that sense, social networks and the death of privacy are actually an increase of privacy because they're sophisticated use of control. Okay, a particularly pernicious term that occurs in the sphere of data is data sharing. Quite often, data sharing, particularly from government organizations, is implied to mean data going to open. Going from, oh, this is held by some government organization, and we're going to share it to mutual benefit. In most cases, it will not become open data in that context. In some cases, it will be shared with other government organizations, which is, in many people's view, leading towards a database state, and not necessarily beneficial to the people who the data is about. And quite often it is sharing, for example, with commercial organizations which can do something useful with it. The narrative in the UK about sharing health information is usually about monetizing health information eventually. And in that sense, it's not going towards open. It's going towards privately held by others. Right? If publishing is the process of making information public that wasn't before, is not so deep. Open access publishing is then an interesting one. Does that make data open? Not necessarily, because open access comes with restrictions on what people can do with it. A particularly nasty one in terms of discussions about personal data is is anonymized something that is a category movement. All right, so we've got personal data, and we want to move it out of that category, or want to do something interesting with it that makes it less of a privacy risk. Where does it end up? I will come back to that, and I think you have another talk in this webinar on that topic at the end as well. Harvesting and scraping, gathering all sorts of information that is public, processing it in some interesting way, and having it privately held. Social media research, and then the big one in modern society to some extent is profiling. Profiling is the process where you start out with big data, and you think there's no deep information hidden in it, and then you apply machine learning algorithms or whatever techniques to turn the information from random people, information about random people to information about groups of people just like somebody else, turning it into finding out, like in this Samaritan's Radar case that I mentioned, data that is intensely personal. So my view on this would be that the biggest problem for data protection for the coming years is that personal data is being generated all the time from data that doesn't look that personal to start with. And in that sense, it relates to anonymization as a converse of profiling being a converse of anonymization in some sense. Oh, and then of course, how do we get big data? Well, one of the ways we get big data is by tracking, by tracking people's web behavior, by tracking people's behavior in the physical world, by all sorts of surveillance, creating facial images, creating mobile location data traces, and suddenly we get big data that's personal and whatever else. Yeah, and the other way of looking at the converse of anonymization is re-identification, information that's potentially personal to start with, somewhat anonymized or not, and then sticking the missing personal information back on there if you can, maybe by combining with external information, maybe by deeper analyzing the information itself. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And the one that we sort of forget is the difference between data and information, right? Which is an old-fashioned idea in computer science that data by itself doesn't constitute information. We'd like that to be big information, but quite often we remain stuck with big data just. Okay, anonymization, re-identification from the legal rather the technical perspective. Particularly in the UK, the EU has the 1995 EU legislation is slightly different, but in the UK the general line has been if somebody's removed some personal information from a data record, and it's not immediately obvious to others how to put that information back in. For example, if it's pseudonymized, then this data is no longer personal and it's outside the scope of data protection, and you can do with it whatever you like. So from a computer science point of view, this may not actually work that well. I will give you some examples of that later. We're moving to a new world in terms of data protection legislation on this particular point. Certainly the UK will have to change its practice in the sense that the GDPR, the new data protection law, defines anonymization as something that nobody can re-identify. So the identifying information is really forever gone. There's not even somebody who's got a key to putting information back somewhere hidden in a vault. So that's a very tight definition of anonymization. Pseudonymization is still in the GDPR, but it takes on a completely different role. Rather than being something that allows people to disregard data protection legislation for such pseudonymized data, it actually says it's a good thing to do, just like encryption, if you like. It's a security control. It is a sensible thing to do because if your data is pseudonymized and it gets lost, then the risk of harm is reduced. So it's an extension of data minimization in some sense, but pseudonymized data is still personal data. In the UK, we have an ongoing movement between government and the health sector, trying to create general unified databases of all medical data, right? And the incarnation of that has just died was called care.data. The one that's still in the pipeline is called data lakes. The idea is all data from doctors' practices and from hospitals gets combined into a national medical data lake, and that's red data in the picture because it is highly identifiable data. Right, and there's a strong information governance process on it, governed by Section 2.51 of the Health and Care Act, which makes sure that it only gets shared with researchers and the like, and hospital organization management people in the right sort of context. And some open data is also published from that, and that's all aggregated data, so individuals cannot be found in that, and small numbers of individuals' data will also have been removed from that. That's green, that's fine. There was in the care.data story, there was a lot of debate about the thing that sits underneath, which is the orange data, amber data, where the data gets pseudonymized, and then it can be shared with anyone and everyone. There were some issues with pseudonyms, pseudonymized data. For example, David Davis, who's now famous for something else, broke his nose 5 times. He's one member of parliament. He broke his nose 5 times. So he said, okay, even if you remove my name from all the records, there's one person who's got their their label in there 5 times, and so if you find someone who's broken their nose 5 times and they're roughly my age, it's probably me. Actually, thinking about it, I'm not entirely true, because I think there will have been a lot of public school boys playing rugby or boxing in his generation that all will have broken their noses a couple of times. But anyway, it was a nice example, right? There's a famous example in the US of pseudonymized data. Governor Weld, who was re-identified in pseudonymized hospital records by Latanya Sweeney, who is now a famous professor in this area. Some of the proponents of pseudonymization being a good thing and anonymization generally working will say to these, though, that yes, you can re-identify some people in a database like that, but not everybody, and there's a low probability that for any given person you can re-identify them, so it's not as harmful as you might make it out to be. Right? In the data that they were looking to anonymize in the UK, they were using these thing called read codes, which is a way of coding GP information. Now, some read codes that were in there were, for example, prescription of medicines, including contraceptives, or diagnosis, including prostate cancer, for example. So even though the gender field was removed from the database in the plans, there were a lot of things that would allow you to reconstruct those. Similar for age, that would be removed from the database, but you can find out the birth event of somebody, and that will tell you when they were born. Vaccinations tell you something about when somebody is born. There's an event for somebody falling after they turn 75. So all these will tell you something about age. You can find out who members of a family are, because they are sharing a GP and they change a GP at the same time. You can find out the mother of somebody as somebody who has a birth event, a pregnancy event that matches the birth event of somebody else. So if you fully pseudonymize this sort of data, you find a lot back, because if you have a complete medical database of everything, you know a lot more. Okay, what I can recommend, I think my time is about to run out. What I can recommend is a more thorough ethical approach to sharing medical data with ethical principles built in, which is in the Nuffield Council on Bioethics report on biological and health data. In general, the UK may be getting a little bit better here. There is a government data science ethics framework. Unfortunately, it has a bit of a role of a do as we say rather than do as we do documents, given the plans that are currently in the pipeline. Labour had some good plans before the election, but most of that didn't actually make their final manifesto. And the big institutes doing